If you've been recording or mixing music for any length of time, you've probably at one point had files that were labeled like Final Mix 2, Final Mix, Final Mix for real this time. Today I'm going to walk you guys through how I label my mix files to keep things organized and making sense. So these are the different mixing sessions from a mix that I did earlier this year, and let me walk you guys through how I have these labeled. So the first thing I'm doing when I'm setting up a mix is obviously I'm opening a session and I'm importing all of the multi-tracks. So that's this one here, Mix Prep 1. I always put the date after it. You don't necessarily have to do that, but definitely Mix Prep 1. That's me loading in all the multi-tracks, going through the multi-tracks, making sure there are no problems with the multi-tracks at all. And then we move on to Mix Prep 2. This is when I import my mixing template into the session. So I have everything routed correctly. I have all the plugins that I usually use queued up and ready to go to make things a lot faster. Now, occasionally after that, I'll do a rough mix, which I usually just do a balance of the faders. I'm usually doing that the day that I'm doing the mix prep because I don't do the actual mix until at least the next morning after I've done the mix prep. The rough mix is just to get a quick balance, just in case there's any problems that I missed earlier on, make sure everything's gonna work together for the most part. Then when I go to actually start mixing, I label it as Mix 1.1. This is the first mix. This is me getting the fader balance. This is me starting to process with plugins. This is gonna be the majority of the mix is Mix 1.1. Then once I get to a point where I think the mix is sounding really good, I'll step away for a minute, clear my head, step into a different sonic environment so that I can reset my ears a little bit, and then I come back, and then I'm saving that session as Mix 1.2 before I listen again at all. This way, if for some reason my ears are really fatigued already and I start to make more decisions and they end up making things worse, I can always go back to Mix 1.1 if I need to. So again, I step away for a few minutes, I come back, I save the session as Mix 1.2, and then I continue mixing. At this point, the mix is usually at a pretty good spot, so it's usually only minor things from here. At this point, I'm gonna check on different sets of monitors, I'm gonna check on different headphones, make sure that everything's translating really well. I'll make some final adjustments to things. Then after that, where I'm at a place where I think the mix sounds really good and it can't get any better at that moment, then I'll step away. I won't come back until at least the next day. Now you'll actually see here that in this particular session, I thought that Mix 1.1 was good enough and I came back the next day with 1.2. That's a little abnormal for me. Usually Mix 1.2 is the same day, but whatever. Point is, Mix 1.1 is the majority of the mixing that's getting everything to where I think it's starting to sound really good and there's probably very little for me to do. Step away, clear my ears, come back, listen again, make a few final tweaks, and then finish for the day. Then I will come back the next day or a couple days later, and I'll open the session again to double check it with completely fresh ears, and that's going to be saved as Mix 1.3 before I start adjusting. So again, I can always go back to Mix 1.2 if I need to. So Mix 1.3 is just double checking the mix on a different day with completely fresh ears. Then after that, as far as I'm concerned, the mix is finished. That's where I'm happy with it. That's where I'm ready to send it to the client. So after Mix 1.3, I'll send that mix to the client. They'll listen to it for a few days, they'll get some notes, and they'll get back to me. Once I have received the notes for what they want changed, and I'm going to do those revisions, when I open the session, I'm now saving that mix as Mix 2.1. Basically, I'm changing the first number every time I send a mix off to the clients. All the 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, etc. That is all things that I'm doing for myself as I make changes. If I'm about to make a big change that I think might somehow fuck things up by accident, I save it as a new version of the session so I can always go back if I need to. So once I've gotten the revision notes from the client, then I'm starting Mix 2.1. I'm working on those revisions. Now, this particular session had a lot of revision notes on the first mix, and that happens sometimes, that's totally fine, but because there were so many changes that needed to be made, I ended up making a lot more versions of this mix just as I went through the revision notes so I could kind of check things off and be like, okay, Mix 2.1 was this part of the revisions, Mix 2.2 was this part of the revisions, 2.3 was this part, and 2.4 was this part of the revisions. Then after 2.4, I had gone through all of their revision notes, it was all the way done. Again, sometimes it won't get all the way to 2.4 here. A lot of the times it's just 0.1, 0.2. 2.4 is actually a little extreme for what I'm used to doing, but it happens sometimes. So after 2.4, I had finished all their revision notes. The mix should now be where they want it, so I send off Mix 2.4. The client listens to it over a few days, they gather a few more notes, they send me a list of notes back. I'm sitting down to do this new set of revisions. I'm opening 2.4 and then I'm saving it as 3.1. I'm doing that set of revisions. All done, sending that off to the client. They still want some more, totally fine. Going to do those revisions, save it as Mix 4.1, and so on. So that's how I label my mixes, guys. When I get to big steps in the process, like if I think I'm mostly done with the mix and I need to step away and reset my ears, I'm gonna save it as a new point number. So 1.1 goes to 1.2 after I've stepped away for a little while. Then when I'm happy with that mix, I send that off to the client, whether it's 1.3, 1.4, it's even gotten to like 1.7 once in a while, you know? But once I'm happy with that first mix, 1 point whatever, I send that off to the client. Then they send me notes for things they want changed. When I sit down to make those changes, I'm saving it as mix 2.1 and so on. This makes it really easy to keep things organized. You can always go back to a previous mix if something happens, because sometimes on mix 3.1, the client has some notes and they send them over, and you go to make mix 4.1 and you make those changes according to their notes. Then when they listen to 4.1, they decide they actually don't like those changes. They preferred the previous mix. So now we can very easily just reopen mix 3.1 and go from there. If they still want changes, then I would save that as 5.1 because now it's a brand new mix based off of originally 3.1. So we're just always labeling big steps as a new mix, and it's allowing us the opportunity to go back to a previous iteration of the mix at any given time. If you've stuck around this long, thank you, because I know this is kind of a boring subject, but it is really important to get this right so that you can always go back to a previous version of the mix so you never lose the right file again.